What's the breaking point where an individual's suppressed life explodes into an act of overwhelming personal violence? We're not talking about a random tragedy or a crime of passion committed in a flash. We're talking about a meticulously staged scene that suggests a mind operating under extreme disassociation, capable of both careful planning and profound rage. Was this an act of calculated execution of a long-held financial motive, or the terrifying result of narcissistic injury that finally shattered a fragile personality? Stick around to find out. This story isn't just about a hatchet. It's not about the song that followed it either. This is a story set in Fall River, Massachusetts, where the life of an unmarried, high society woman was dominated by her father's suffocating control of her own deep-seated resentment. She wanted to be a figure of power. Instead, she was a prisoner in her own luxurious cage. The most shocking psychological takeaway is the analysis of her bizarre, almost as if she's acting in a theater, behavior immediately following the discovery. This is the only ethical clinical breakdown of this 1892 psychological case study that you'll hear anytime soon. So get ready for this Victorian horror story. Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I focus on the psychology and mental health dynamics behind the most compelling and complex crimes. This analysis is my professional speculation based on historical records. It's not a clinical diagnosis of anyone in this video. And I want to offer a trigger warning here. This case involves family violence. Viewer discretion is advised. Without further ado, let's pull back the curtains on this domestic pressure cooker that eventually blew up in Fall River. This is the story of Lizzie Borden. The foundation for this case was laid decades before the summer heat of 1892. Andrew Borden, a wealthy yet notoriously frugal businessman, ran his home at 92nd Street with a stern and distant hand. He possessed a controlling nature, despite his considerable fortune, and his daughters, Emma and Lizzie, lived an anachronistic life without modern comforts like indoor plumbing, a common feature in other homes of their stature. Lizzie lost her mother at a young age, and her deep devotion to her father later warped into a profound resentment, especially after he married Abby Gray Borden, their stepmother. Abby's introduction into the house created a split family dynamic, a classic precursor for severe familiar discord. Lizzie and Emma viewed Abby not as a parent, but as a direct financial competitor. The psychological precursor was an environment defined by emotional repression and an obsession with material inheritance. Andrew's refusal to grant his adult daughters independence or access to the wealth they felt entitled to left Lizzie, an active churchwoman and socialite, in a state of profound psychological infancy. This created a breeding ground for narcissistic injury, where a deep sense of unfulfilled entitlement festers into rage. The family friction didn't just simmer, it actively escalated into years leading up to the crime. In 1887, the rift widened dramatically when Andrew purchased a house for Abby's sister, further cementing his commitment to his second wife's side of the family. Lizzie and Emma fought back, demanding and receiving a rental property of their own, but the damage was done. The final dispute confirmed Lizzie's worst fears, that Abby was actively diluting her inheritance. A notable red flag occurred just days before the murders. The entire household, including the maid, Bridget, suffered a sudden violent illness, possibly due to spoiled food, but suspicions of poisoning lingered for decades. Adding to the sinister atmosphere, Lizzie had visited a local druggist the day before the murders, inquiring about buying 10 cents worth of prussic acid, or cyanide, allegedly to clean a sealskin cloak. This highly peculiar action, a middle-class woman admitting to procure a deadly poison for a mundane cleaning chore, paints a picture of a mind exploring lethal, secretive avenues to resolve an intolerable solution. The escalation was a move from passive resentment to an active consideration of violence, all stemming from a psychological need to reclaim control over her environment and her inheritance. The morning of August 4th, 1892 provides one of the most curious crime timelines in history, and it's here we can see the clearest links between action and possible motivation. Andrew Borden, his wife Abby, the servant Bridget, and Andrew's brother-in-law John Morse were all at the house early that day. When Andrew left for his morning rounds and John Morse departed to visit relatives, only the three women remained. Around 9 a.m., while Bridget was outside washing the first floor windows, a request from Abby, the first murder occurred. Abby Borden was found upstairs in the guest room, struck approximately 19 times to the head with a hatchet. The sheer overkill of the attack suggests a motive rooted in extreme personalized rage rather than just a quick, clean murder for gain. This level of violence against the woman Lizzie resented for so long points to a sudden explosive release of years of repressed fury. Lizzie then had the benefit of the unseen hour, a 2-hour gap between the murder of her stepmother and the murder of her father. This gap, revealed by the medical examiner, transformed the event from a double homicide frenzy into two distinct deliberate acts. When Andrew returned home around 10:30 a.m., Bridget was resting in the attic, having finished her window washing. Then Andrew lay down on the sitting room sofa. Sometime after this, he was struck 10 to 11 times while taking a nap. This discovery was made by Lizzie, who called for Bridget, announcing that someone had killed her father. Her immediate actions are a crucial clue. She was reportedly calm, composed, and unemotional, and giving conflicting accounts to the police about her whereabouts. First saying she was in the barn, then saying she was in the kitchen. This strange tranquility and the contradictory alibis are a final piece of the puzzle, suggesting a mind that had successfully compartmentalized the horror it had just committed. The circumstantial evidence, like the hatchet with the freshly broken handle, later found in the basement, it never quite came full circle for the jury. The community, however, had already pieced together the clues, the financial motivation, the strange acid purchase, and the utter lack of emotion from the daughter. The lack of blood on Lizzie, despite the horrific violence, remains a peculiar detail, and one that leads us to the heart of the psychological analysis. We have the facts, the financial tensions, the conflicting alibis, and the 2-hour gap of silence. Now it's time to put on a clinical lens and analyze the mind behind the violence. This is my speculations, not a diagnosis. What kind of a psychological process will allow a person to commit two such brutal acts and then immediately assume an air of calm, as if she's an actor in a play? Could it be distress? My professional speculation centers on two potential yet interlinked mechanisms: disassociation and a high degree of repressed rage stemming from a lifetime of emotional invalidation. First, disassociation is a psychological defense mechanism where a person separates themselves from their thoughts, feelings, memories, or even their sense of self. For Lizzie, a woman trapped by Victorian norms and her father's purse strings, a lifetime of suppressed desires and rage could have led to the creation of a deeply divided inner world. The person who purchased the acid, who felt entitled to her father's wealth, and who hated her stepmother, could have been an entirely separate psychological entity from the one who was the quiet Sunday school teacher. In this scenario, the violent act was committed during a brief but complete dissociative fugue where the repressed rage took over the conscious self. This would explain the lack of blood found on her. The disassociated mind operating outside of a conscious moral controls could execute a brutal murder with a strange clinical efficiency. She could clean up without even remembering. The second aspect is the sheer personalized violence towards Abby Borden, those 19 blows to her head. This is a psychological signature of a motive that goes far beyond money. It's an outpouring of hatred directed at the primary symbol of her containment and her financial block. It suggests a narcissistic personality structure that experienced the stepmother's existence as an unbearable injury and threat, leading to a profound homicidal breakdown of her emotional regulation. We can't just analyze a potential perpetrator. We must ethically acknowledge the psychological dynamics that made the victims vulnerable. Andrew Borden, by all accounts, was an emotionally unavailable and controlling figure. His primary vulnerability was his predictability of his routine and his strict management of the household. This constant control, which simultaneously provided for and restricted his daughters, created a toxic dynamic that essentially guaranteed high-stakes emotional confrontation. Abby Borden, the stepmother, likely suffered from the psychological stress of being an outsider in her own home. She was in a passive role, caught between her husband's stinginess and her stepdaughter's open resentment, a dynamic of emotional isolation that could lead to a psychological state of learned helplessness. Her vulnerability was her physical and social position in the house. In a family where she was financially and emotionally subordinate, she became an easy and eventually a deadly target for years of redirected rage. The jury comprised of men who struggled to believe a woman of Lizzie's social standing and outward demeanor could be capable of such a heinous, bloody crime, ultimately acquitted her after less than 90 minutes of deliberation. Lizzie, who changed her name to Lisbeth, and her sister Emma used their inheritance to buy a mansion on the hill named Maplecroft. But they were pariahs. The acquittal simply shifted the conviction from the courtroom to the court of public opinion. 10 years later, the emotional weight of what had happened became too much for their already strained relationship. Emma, who had stood by her sister through the trial, finally left Maplecroft. She could no longer reconcile the woman she loved with the facts of the crime, suggesting her own final heartbreaking loss of faith in her sister's innocence. Lizzie died ostracized and alone in 1927, leaving nothing to Emma in her will. The true resolution of the story is that sometimes escaping justice in the eyes of the law only results in a more profound, enduring psychological imprisonment. If you like this psychological breakdown, you'll love this next video that centers on the unimaginable. Thank you for watching today, and until next time, stay curious, stay safe.